Mr. Lyons' notion of a parallel polis was familiar to us, since it had guided our work behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. While the major American foundations were supporting foolish and utopian projects like nuclear disarmament, Bradley surreptitiously funded the activities of Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia, Solidarity in Poland, and Memorial in the Soviet Union. Even after the Iron Curtain fell, thanks to Dan and Mike, Bradley continued to work to kickstart free civil associations in the civic ruins of the former Soviet Union. Bradley contributed to the Salvation Army in Moscow, bought a bus for a scout troop run by a Russian Orthodox nun, and funded a Muslim group caring for single expectant mothers and battered women in Kazan. Our experience led us to wonder if there might not be also a parallel polis here at home in America. After all, by the 1990s, no one believed anymore that our vast, costly, therapeutic social service state was meeting the needs of our citizens. Even the Democrats were saying that it was time to reinvent government. If free civil society groups arose to meet those needs under totalitarian rule, surely we could find the same sorts of civic vitality here within the associational nation celebrated by Alexis de Tocqueville. As it turned out, we found plenty of activity. In our own backyard, for instance, Milwaukee's Black community had been trying for decades to reform the costly and ineffective local school system. All such efforts, however, had been systematically thwarted by the powerful teachers' unions. And so Black Milwaukeeans, along with other disgruntled religious and ethnic groups, had undertaken at great personal expense to found their own educational institutions. Soon, Baptist, Pentecostal, Hispanic, Muslim, and Orthodox Jewish schools joined a pre-existing array of Catholic and Lutheran schools. Just as Bradley had supported dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, so now through school choice, it supported these critical civic institutions in the face of the establishment's fierce opposition. We conservatives like to think that school choice sprang full-grown from the brow of Milton Friedman, but the fact is that without the unsung labors of those ethnic and religious insurgents in Milwaukee long before the Bradley Foundation had been founded, and without having read a word of Friedman, school choice would have remained an economist's dream. It occurred to us from this work, were there possibly within our hard-pressed communities yet other such institutions, a larger parallel polis that we had simply not seen before? What if we had overlooked it because it wasn't built by conservative intellectuals in elegant theory, but rather in messy, everyday practice by those struggling against the abuse and neglect of the social service state? Maybe we had been looking for Tocqueville in all the wrong places. So we asked Bob Woodson to come to Milwaukee and survey the landscape. Woodson, as many of you know, is the premier champion of low-income grassroots groups and their innate capacity to understand and solve their own problems. He checked in with the local barbershops, hair salons, and taverns, asking this question: to whom do people turn first in this neighborhood when they need help? It was never the licensed social worker at the local public mental health clinic. It was always the pastor at the storefront church or the beloved grandmother running the neighborhood daycare. And so by tapping into local wisdom, seeking out those who possessed moral, not credentialed authority, Woodson brought to our attention Bill Locke's church-based incubator, Victor Barnett's basketball program for at-risk youth, Cordelia Taylor's community-based senior care facility, and dozens of other homegrown organizations. Their legitimacy came not from their willingness to parrot a political line, but rather from their ability to solve the immediate, everyday problems of this particular neighborhood. Founded by the communities themselves to solve their own problems according to their own moral and religious lights, they became for us domestic versions of the parallel polis we found behind the Iron Curtain. Now, Bob Woodson has been my friend and mentor ever since our days together at the American Enterprise Institute. in the 70s, where he was working on Peter Berger and Father Richard John Newhouse's Mediating Structures project. More recently, Bob reminded us that it was precisely Black America's historical ability to create its own parallel polis that allowed it to survive and even flourish, giving the lie to the 1619 Project's narrative of Black helplessness in the face of America's settler colonialism. So it's no wonder that I found Mr. Lyons' notion of a conservative parallel polis appealing. As he pointed out in his talk to the European NatCon conference, we are indeed awash with economic, social, and spiritual problems that have not been solved by, and indeed have been exacerbated by, our vast bureaucratic empire of service providers. Just as it happened behind the Iron Curtain, whoever steps forward with effective, practical, immediate solutions to those problems will secure the future. By way of friendly amendment, though, I would point out that conservatives need not create their own social service complex. Sending an enthusiastic corps of volunteers into the inner city preaching moral reformation would enjoy no more success than have progressivism's therapeutic legions. Following Bob Woodson's lead, it's instead possible to discover the institutions of a parallel polis, institutions that make up in moral authority what they lack in material resources. But the problem is they don't look conservative to us. They've never written an op-ed calling for tax cuts for the wealthy. They don't subscribe to National Review. They may never have cast a vote for a Republican, if only because there are very few Republicans on the local ballots. They may even have a tattered copy of Barack Obama's Hope poster on their walls. Nonetheless, through the very act of assuming responsibility for solving their own problems, they embody Tocquevillian principles. They thereby reject progressivism's claim that only professional experts are competent to address our problems. They also thereby reject the contemporary left's claim that only revolution can address the disabling effects of settler colonialism. These grassroots groups, by example and by exhortation, teach personal responsibility, self-discipline, spiritual commitment, and civic obligation. They may not refer explicitly to the founders' writings about the importance of Republican virtues, but they embody and practice those virtues every day because, as the founders themselves told us, only such virtues enable truly self-governing individuals and communities. It's no surprise, then, that American conservatives have, in fact, periodically embraced Woodson's understanding of grassroots civil society. Ronald Reagan had his private sector initiatives effort. George H.W. Bush championed 1,000 Points of Light. And George W. Bush launched a program of faith-based and community initiatives. But the embrace is fleeting. It takes patience, not public relations, to build trusting relationships with unorthodox allies. The left is ever vigilant to disrupt those relationships by waving the bloody shirt of racism. And our own conservatism incorporated insists that such uncomfortable long-term work really isn't necessary. They say, just give our DC think tanks, nonprofits, a few million more here to win this next election, or maybe pass this next piece of federal legislation, and our cause will triumph at last. We already have a conservative parallel polis in those edifices along Massachusetts and Pennsylvania avenues, don't we? No, we don't. As Lyons points out, our lavishly funded think tanks and nonprofits are only there to tinker with the details of the social service state, not to challenge it wholesale. The parallel polis delivers effective, concrete, long-lasting services at the local level, not fleeting partisan victories in the Capitol. Nonetheless, this year alone, conservatives will contribute hundreds of millions of dollars to political campaigns which will instantaneously evaporate into TV airtime. A fraction of that money diverted to supporting grassroots groups of the type I've been discussing would begin to build enduring relationships of trust that would have immense long-term effects. The effects wouldn't be all in one direction. That's another reason why working with the grassroots parallel polis can be challenging. We may hope to bring those groups over to our larger political principles in time as trust is built up. But that trust will only be built if it flows both ways, only if we're prepared to learn from our grassroots allies as well. We must be willing to integrate their experience and their wisdom into our own policy prescriptions. No one understands better than grassroots groups at a granular level how the social service state has failed. And no one knows better how they might be reformed or replaced, often in ways that are going to be completely mysterious to conservative policy intellectuals. This will not be the first movement in human history to flourish by incorporating the wisdom of unorthodox groups hitherto exiled to the margins of respectable society. Mr. Lyons is right. It's time to build a conservative parallel polis, but the outline of the polis is already there to be discovered and nurtured. It's up to us to provide it the attention and resources that it deserves.